Hello, everyone, and welcome to CCAG's latest climate conversation. I am Mitzi Jonelle Tan, a climate justice activist from the Philippines, and I'll be hosting our conversation today. For those of you who are new to this series, in each episode, we invite some of the world's leading thinkers and doers to delve into a critical climate issue. For this episode, we'll be looking at sustainable food systems and how we must urgently work together across governments and industries to develop ways of producing food which are good not just for the health of people, but also for our planet. And I'm joined today by Henry Dimbleby MBE and Sir David King. A British entrepreneur and cookery writer, Henry is a chief author of the UK's landmark National Food Strategy, which has been heralded not just as a masterly study of the UK's food problem, but also a framework wide enough to be deployed for studying the food problems societies face everywhere. In it, Henry describes the world's food systems as both a miracle and a disaster, producing enough calories to feed 7.8 billion of us, the biggest global population in human history, but as catastrophic cost to our planet. And Sir David King was the UK government's chief scientific advisor from 2000 to 2007 and permanent representative for climate change from 2013 to 2017. He is also the founder of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, the international scientific body created to inform and guide climate repair. I'm delighted to have you both here today.
It's great to be here.
So let's start this off right away. Sir Henry, could you tell us a little bit about what you set out to do with your strategy and just why it's so important for us to overhaul what you call the faulty mechanics of the global food system? What exactly is at stake?
Well, as experts like David know, it is very hard to overstate the problems the food system causes the planet. And I'll set aside for the purpose of this conversation the fact that it is also by far the biggest cause of avoidable health issues as well. But the food system is, by an order of magnitude, the biggest cause of the destruction of biodiversity. It is the biggest cause of deforestation. It's the biggest cause of the removal of animal life from our oceans, the biggest cause of freshwater stress and pollution. And with energy, it is one of the two big causes of climate change. It produces between 20 and 30% globally of greenhouse gases. And yet most people think of it as a niche issue. So, for example, if you look at the last COP26, which was meant to be about climate and biodiversity, food hardly featured. It was talked about in the fringes, and it needs to be right in the center of the debate, because if you solve the issues in the food system, you pretty much solve our environmental issues, and you go a long way to addressing climate change.
Exactly. And a lot of people don't realize just how connected food security and food sovereignty are to the climate crisis and how they both really interplay with each other. So as you developed the strategy, who was it important for you to talk to and listen to? Like, were there any lessons for policymakers in other countries as they seek to rapidly transform their food systems?
Yes, I think it's incredibly important because a lot of these decisions are, particularly in the food system, are very personal. It's about the state getting involved in what we put in our bodies, and that is about as personal a relationship between citizenry and the state as you could imagine. And therefore, you have to, we as well as kind of engaging with experts all around the country, we held deliberative dialogues. So we got groups of citizens in 5 different areas of the country, broadly speaking, east, west, north, south, and central, representing the demography of those areas to discuss not only the issues, but the solutions. And I'm sure we'll come on to this meat in more detail, because meat sits at the heart of a lot of this. But we think that actually governments, it's much easier to engage in quite an interventionist way in the health issues, easier than it is with meat, because meat is very difficult politically. And so you have to find a way through that not only will enable you to solve the fundamental mathematical equation, which is how do we produce from the same amount of land enough food while restoring biodiversity and sequestering carbon. You have to solve that equation, but you also have to give governments policies that they will actually be able to get through without being voted out of office. And therefore, who you talk to and how you frame your solutions is critical.
I think it's so important what you said about how it's so personal with how we deal with the food systems, because a lot of people don't realize that what we're eating and what we're putting into our bodies is part of a systemic issue. And I think that is one of the things that needs to be changed so that we can get people more on board with changing the food systems as well. In your report, you call for a food system for the future that must help restore nature and halt climate change so that we can hand on a healthier planet to our children. What do you think is holding us back from making the required changes to achieve this? You mentioned that we have to push policies that governments will put in without being voted out. Could you expound a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so how do you solve the problem? And I think I'll come to this, that there is a different problem for, if you look at what climate change is going to do to food systems, it is broadly going to increase productivity in the temperate north because you'll have more carbon dioxide in the air, warmer climates, and so we expect wheat yields to rise. And then in the south, we expect rice and maize yields to fall. And if you look at that on a global map, that looks like, to me, it looks like mass migration and warfare, coming to your point about food sovereignty. You know, you've got a real a movement of where food will be produced globally. So what is the solution? Well, first of all, you have to recognize that you have to restore biodiversity. You have to sequester carbon. It's not good enough for the food system to be net zero because there are other industries that will continue to produce emissions which need to be mopped up by the land. So you need to be net negative, biodiversity positive, and produce enough food. And actually, in the northern hemisphere, luckily, the areas which are best suited to biodiversity restoration are also quite well suited to climate, to carbon sequestration. And so you can solve that equation. You can get that equation where you can restore biodiversity, sequester carbon, produce food, but only if you reduce waste. And we define waste in a broader sense. So there's kind of typical food waste that people think about, of throwing away food at the farm gate, in your kitchen, in the supermarket. But there's also a productivity waste. So farming is done at very different levels of productivity. And often the more productive farms are the less environmentally damaging. So you have to improve skills and productivity. And then finally, you have to make better use of your land. And at the moment, 85% of the land that the UK uses, about 77% of land worldwide to produce its food, is used either to produce food to feed to animals or to produce food or for pasture to graze animals. And animals now, by biomass, weigh twice as much as all humans on the planet and 10 times as much as all land vertebrates. I mean, it's just, and there's just too much. We need that land back to sequester carbon and restore biodiversity. So we have to stop wasting our land. And actually, interestingly, a lot of people talk about methane from animals. That's almost a MacGuffin. It's almost, yes, it's important because it's a brake. It's one of the few brakes that we have reducing methane on climate change. But actually, the amount of land that you could sequester by repurposing the use of that land is much greater than the effect that you would get simply from reducing methane emissions. So how do you do this? Very briefly. Well, we said on this side, first of all, you need, in the words of Siddhartha Dasgupta, is one of our great economists, you need to make nature visible in the equation. So at the moment, nature doesn't appear in any of the systems that we use to measure mankind's success. Balance sheets of companies, GDP, it's not there. So you need to make it present. You then need to say, okay, how do we solve the equation? And once you've made nature present, you then need to do a land use framework. You need to look at the land and you'd say, what land do we need? Where do we need to do what with the land? You then need to introduce a regulatory framework. Luckily, we subsidize the destruction of nature through large-scale farming to huge cost, billions of dollars annually. And you move that money paying for public goods, for carbon sequestration and restoration. You increase regulation. And then finally, you have to get people to eat less meat. And here we concluded that you couldn't hit that head on. Our focus groups began to fizz with energy and anger when you talked about meat taxes, those kind of things. But we think that by doing three things, by working on methane suppressing technologies for ruminants, by working on alternative proteins, which could easily take over from meat in a lot of the processed dairy and meat that we eat, and then by bringing about externally a cultural change on meat, which actually it doesn't hurt a lot of the food, the FMCG companies and the supermarkets, it doesn't hurt their profit lines. That's something they can do. We think you can probably get about the 30% meat reduction that you need in order to make the equations work.
It's interesting to me what you said about nature not being visible in the equations. I've had the privilege to be able to work with a lot of small farmers here in the Philippines. So just a little bit of context, in the Philippines, there's still a huge landlessness problem. So the farmers don't actually own their own land. The people who own the land are multinational businesses who create monocrop plantations, which just drains the fertility of the soil. But when we're talking to small farmers, it is so clear to them how you have to take care of the land in order to keep producing the food. And so I feel like that is such a crucial cultural change, which you were talking about, and there's so much that needs to be done. But picking up on Henry, what Henry has said, Sir David, how much time do you think we have to take these decisive actions to tackle climate change?
Gosh, that's a very heavy question. So first of all, I just want to thank Henry for the work he's done. I think it's been absolutely wonderful. We are on what could only be described as a terrible trajectory. And in many ways, it is alarming. And fortunately, we're now having discussions about how to avoid the worst of these things happening. What the latest analysis of lost land due to sea level rise indicates is that the country of Vietnam, the whole country of Vietnam, 90% of the landmass will be under seawater once a year by 2050, in just less than 30 years' time. And of course, I say that because the Mekong Delta, which is responsible for the fact that Vietnam is very close to sea level, Mekong River bringing down silt to create the whole country of Vietnam means it's very close to sea level. The first big country to suffer terribly, but the whole world suffers because Vietnam is the third biggest rice producer in the world. The Mekong Delta has the biggest paddy fields in the world. So we are looking in a very near future at a series of follow-up disasters, not only a food crisis, but also environmental migration. In the end, where do the people of Vietnam go? Where do the people of Bangladesh go? So there are major problems associated with rising sea levels, let alone all the other climate change events that are now happening. We saw last year extreme weather events right around the Northern Hemisphere during the 3 polar summer months. And the Climate Crisis Advisory Group put out a report at the end of August showing this is all related to what is happening in the Arctic Circle region, which is now heating up at 4 times the rate of the rest of the planet, because the Arctic ice melts rapidly now. It's a very thin layer of ice over the Arctic Sea as soon as the sun comes back. And so during the polar summer, the temperature around the North Pole is now horribly high. So we're looking at real transitions happening in real time today. So your question, how much time have we got? We're coming to this problem very late. I'm not writing it off at all. And that's why the Climate Crisis Advisory Group was formed, because we want to show that there are ways forward. And they do engage many aspects of government. And I just want to commend another aspect, a particular aspect of what Henry's saying. We need governments to understand that the most important instrument they have is regulation. And introducing regulation speeds up, for example, the transition away from fossil fuels. If we just let that happen, it's going to take far too long. We're already too late in many ways. But I think every aspect of this needs governments to understand their responsibility in this process. And of course, again, Henry is absolutely right. How do governments in democracy stay in power if the people don't like what these regulations do? So we all have to take the public with us. And Mitzi, that's what you do and what you do very well. So I think that each one of us has a critical role to play. Let me just take the issue of methane emissions from land. Of course, rice is also a big methane emitter. And so it's livestock and rice. Why is the emission rate from land going up at the moment, from farmland? It's precisely because the rapidly emerging economies, particularly around your part of the world, Mitzi, but the rapidly emerging economies are switching over to more and more meat consumption. And I do believe that is simply imitating the North, right? So I'm saying this because the North has a major responsibility. We have to be able to demonstrate that we can switch away from the enormous overeating of meat that is happening in our countries. And when I say enormous, there's nothing to do with diet. Right? We're eating far more in excess of what diets require. So I think that so many points, Henry is hitting exactly on the button. We need to examine health measures that improve the health of our population, and that is mostly very popular with the population, so it shouldn't be a vote loser. But in doing that, we need to emphasize the health consequences of eating badly. And eating too much meat is eating badly not only for you, but also for the planet. So I think there are many ways in which we have to respond, and we have no time to waste. You know, there literally is no time to waste.
I think that it's a very interesting question, that the question of how long have we got? Because the answer is literally unknowable. It's a complex system. And, you know, if you look at what's going on in the Arctic at the moment, if you look at the weakness of the Gulf Stream, it could tip at any moment. And my view is that there are going to, you know, we're not, the Holocene is going to end in some form. This period of stable climate is going to end in some form, and it could be, you know, could be in the next 5 years, and it'll happen quickly. And so it's almost like kind of standing on a burning platform and having a discussion about how long before the platform's legs give way and you go into the water and trying to work that out. It's like, no, let's put out the fire, because the system is unsustainable, which means it will fall apart. It's just a matter of how much damage you do before you shift to a system that is sustainable.
I love how you both answered that question, because I actually hate it when I get asked, how much time do we have left? I hate how climate conversations are reduced to, oh, we have 8 years left, as if the climate crisis isn't already happening, as you guys just mentioned, as if it's so difficult to be able to say that elegantly, to say that we both simultaneously have a bit of time before the worst happens. We don't know how much time it is, but also we have no more time. And you have to find that balance to be able to make sure that people don't completely lose hope and think, oh, it's already the end of the world. And, you know, knowing that there is an urgency. And it's exactly what you guys said about it's a systemic issue. It's about the mode of production, the way that food is produced. And so that was my next question, actually, for Henry. Are there any countries or organizational bodies that you'd point to as exemplars of sustainable food production?
No, I don't think there are any countries that are doing it. And I think that we are, if you look at my concern, if you look at bodies, is that they are generally tend to be quite ideologically driven, and they tend to focus on one solution. So, you know, in Europe, and there's a strong contingent in Britain, the solution that is much pushed is this kind of regenerative model of agriculture, which in most interpretations of that involves too much livestock. It involves bringing livestock increasingly into rotations. And you can solve the equation for biodiversity and food production then, but you can't solve it for carbon. George Monbiot, in his recent book, argued basically for the removal of all traditional farming and the fermentation of proteins. And if that was the case, you would lose a lot of our traditional ecosystems. But actually, I see, and kind of, you will see all of those things happening. So in the UK, for example, we want to restore our uplands. There's no point in grazing livestock on them. It just kills the, it destroys the biodiversity, and it doesn't sequester the carbon we could by growing trees. We want to produce food in the east, probably at quite high yield with reduced inputs, and then sequester that carbon elsewhere. If you're in Egypt, which is a country which has a population, because of the amazing advances in food technology and transport, has a population that will never be sustainable on the amount of farming land they have, then I can see with solar power coming down very quickly that that green hydrogen feeding fermented proteins would be a big part of your food security there. So I think that we need to get real. We need to focus on the equation, the fundamental equation, biodiversity, carbon and food production, and the solutions for that will be different in different parts of the world. I do think there is a future that is potentially attractive to all people. So I look at kind of, in some ways, I look at the system that we have now as a system one, and our job at the moment is just to reduce the harms we're doing with the current food system. But there is a system too that could happen where technology, in particular very cheap solar power, takes a lot of pressure off the land, and you have a combination of food produced under lights and fermentation with regenerative systems, where countries like Egypt become food secure and we free up land for nature and sequester carbon. I think there is actually quite an optimistic, if you're not ideologically driven, there's quite a fantastic solution, but the cost of solar power needs to continue to come down to make that possible.
Go ahead, David.
I just wanted to ask Henry, is the international body sitting in Switzerland doing any of the kind of things that you're talking about now? I'm talking about the body that is equivalent to the WHO, but is meant to be dealing with farming. And if not, how do we get moving with a significant body on the international scale that can really begin to push this all through? It's got to be done very quickly. I don't believe we should wait for 197 nations in the United Nations to set it all up. So how do we move this whole agenda much more quickly across the world?
Well, it's really interesting. So I was at a meeting earlier in the year where we had Eartha Cousin, who was there, who used to be head of the World Food Programme, and the current head of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, I think. And I was struck by how, particularly Eartha Cousin, how ideological she was. So her concerns, rightly, she was very strongly concerned with the issues that you were talking about, Mitzi, about the role and the circumstances for farmers in developing countries and how they'd had their sovereignty taken away from them and that kind of stuff. And that's important. But when we talked about the fact that agroecological stuff was had its problems as well, she was like, oh, she got really angry. She didn't like it. It's like, why? Why? And I think it's because she saw the kind of big technological advances of big companies as bad from the lens of what it had done in the past to small farmers. And so, kind of to answer your question directly, David, no, I don't think we have the institutions yet. I haven't seen evidence that we have the institutions yet. David Beasley was very interesting. It was right at the beginning of the Ukraine war, and it was just becoming clear that the Russians were keeping the corn in the silos and moving it away. And I think that if you look at the pressure that's going to put over the next 5 years on the Lebanon, on Egypt, on the Middle East, I hope that we can actually, that organization will become less ideological on certain parts and become a bit more pragmatic. But, what do we do? I don't know. Mitzi asked me what I was trying to do with the report at the beginning. And I was trying to do two things. One was create a new way of describing how the food system works and the problems in it, because most people don't understand how the food system works, either on health or on food security. And the other was to get some specific policies in place. And actually the former of those two things is the more important. So we need collectively, David was saying that you, Mitzi, are doing this collectively, you need to change the story in society so that the politicians can then use their power to make the right regulations. But I don't think there is anybody, any organization, any country who is really doing that well at the moment.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I see the same thing too, because a lot of these countries and a lot of these governments and leaders, they don't listen to what people are saying. There are scientists offering these solutions. They may not be perfect. We have to try them out every time, but we have to give them the chance to be tried out first. With that, for both of you guys, what is your message to these governments and leaders who aren't doing enough in terms of regulation, in terms of looking at our food production?
David, do you want to go?
So I think the first thing to say is that Henry is a contributor to a discussion that is now happening at a high level. I think the advantage of George Monbiot's book is not that it gets everything right, but it stirs up the discussion. And I think that's where we've got to be. I don't think anyone has all the answers, but what we need is, if you like, intellectual discussion at a high level that can then play a leadership role in terms of both the public and the governments of the world. I think some governments are beyond help on this issue, and that is also, of course, very frustrating. But nevertheless, I think if there's enough pressure from the people, that all turns around, and we all know that in democracies. So I think unfortunately, it sounds as if we're a long way from achieving this. And I say unfortunately because we've got to short circuit all of these discussions and move towards action.
Yes, I mean, I would say exactly the same. If you look at, there is progress. If you look at the UK, for example, at the moment, it would be difficult to hold us up as a paragon of stable democracy. I don't know when this is going to come out, but our Prime Minister resigned yesterday after over 50 members of his government resigned. But on the environmental side, actually, we have the frameworks now in place that if the flesh that was put on those bones was done the right way, we would transform our food system. So in legislation, we have recognized that we shouldn't pay farmers for producing food. We should pay them for public goods. We've recognized that we've set targets, statutory binding targets on restoring biodiversity and on carbon. Now, that is the right conceptual framework. You obviously then have to actually bring in the specific ways in which you make those payments and you do those regulations. And there's all sorts of ways in which that could go wrong. But it's pretty exciting, actually, to be in a country which has got the framework right. We haven't got the framework right on health at all. We're miles behind on health. But so that's really reassuring. Now, the question, because other governments copy, right? So I helped the government do this. I had a conversation with the German government a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about how they might do their food strategy. So ideas are very powerful. They're at one point, sometimes they're like butterflies. They flit around, and you have to be very careful and look for them and not destroy them and pick them. But actually, when an idea, a strong idea and a right idea gets into the system, it can move very fast, particularly if it is kind of, cheered on by people like you and by broader society. So I am, it is about those ideas, and it's about injecting all of us as movers. I love George's book, actually. I wasn't trying to be critical of him. And I think he intentionally just turned the dial up to 100 at the end. But he's right about almost everything in that book. So yes, it's about getting those ideas into governments, into the people making power, and then giving them the space to realize that they can do it and still remain in power, because in the end, they aren't going to do things if they're going to get voted out of office. They're just not. In fact, they would say that we shouldn't be doing things. It is the nature of democracy that we shouldn't be doing things if they get us voted out of office.
I would just, however, slightly disagree with you there, Henry, which is leadership from government.
Yes. You're right.
You do need that kind of leadership.
No, you're right. You need someone who works out who's prepared to work out how they can be part of changing the public's mind. I agree.
That's the thing, though. Do our leaders actually pay attention to majority of people's decisions, or the people who have money and who have, funding, and that's also the other conversation.
So a little glimpse behind the curtain. So, both on health and on the environment. I'm the lead non-executive director at DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs here, as well as doing the writing the food strategy. And behind the scenes, ministers and officials do have pretty blunt conversations about what needs to be done. And when it works really well, they decide you see a situation where the politicians understand they have to do something. Health is a good example in this country now. They've seen what's happening to our National Health Service. They know there has to be intervention. They're ideologically resistant to it, a right-wing government, because it involves intervention, but they can see. So they're now in this stage where there's a kind of, the cogs are grinding in their brains. And then they do quite a lot of work on interventions. So for example, I've seen things about interventions, how you talk about an intervention, putting that out to focus groups. So they're thinking about, okay, I see that this policy needs to come in. How can I frame that in a way that makes it doable? So I do think there are people out there who, in politics, who are trying to do a bit of that leadership. At the same time, they do have food companies, at their ears all the time. In the UK, we just had Kellogg's take the government to court and lose, trying to stop them restricting the sale of some and promotion of some sugary cereal. So it is exactly the kind of tussle inside that you'd imagine from outside, but it's not just the politicians sitting down with the money and ruling and kind of ruling the world. It is actually a tussle between what they want to do and what they think is right and what they think they can do. I wouldn't be a politician. David's seen it from the inside, out during foot and mouth and stuff. So he'll probably have an interesting reflection on that as well.
Yes, I think my answer to that is I worked with 4 prime ministers from Blair through to May, and the character of the head of government is actually a critical factor. And I think we're all aware of that today in Britain. When I was with Blair and Brown, I would say that their responses were, to me, get out there on the media and see if we can get the public behind what you're saying. It's very, very different from the present government and from the government since David Cameron, frankly. So I think that in itself indicates a sense of self-confidence from the head of government to say to a chief scientific advisor, I'm not going to sit next to you. You go and handle the foot and mouth disease epidemic. That gave me a voice. And then, okay, you're saying we need nuclear energy to manage the climate change problem. Get out there and explain to the public. Try and take them with you. So I think the role of government in allowing its experts to get out there and take the public with them is pretty important.
I definitely agree. And I think one of the next important steps is also making sure that Global North leaders understand that it's not just about their own country and their own citizens anymore. Not just anymore, but for the longest time, but that countries, especially like the UK, which has historically exploited global South countries, has a big responsibility in ensuring the food security and the just transition of, developing countries as well. And, just talking about the exportation of food from our countries into global north countries, where a lot of developing countries, they end up creating food that's not for people in their own country, but rather for the global north. So that's an entirely different topic, I think. But to end the thing, yeah, go ahead.
So Mitzi, interestingly, on here, the Prime Minister resigned yesterday. We're already beginning to have a leadership battle in the Conservative Party here in the UK. And there was one candidate who was talking, a man called Steve Baker, who was saying yesterday, we've got to get away from all this green rubbish and et cetera, et cetera. And first, I'm going to say two things about that. The first answer is actually the public want it. So we are now in a situation, if you look at what the public worry about, the environmental issues are always in the top three. The second argument may make is, what is the point in us doing it here in the UK when China's doing X, Y, Z and America's doing X, Y, Z? We're tiny. And for me, that is all about the ideas, because if we can prove here in the UK that we can solve that equation, we make it a hell of a lot easier for other people to do it. So I actually feel that the public, although at a high level, are behind it, and that it is really important for even small developed nations such as ours to lead on this, because we have the wealth and the relative stability to help governments who don't have those things work out what the solutions are.
I fully agree with Henry. Absolutely. I mean, that is the position I took with Tony Blair on climate change. I said to him, we're an island nation, rising sea levels. We're going to lose London unless we can take real action. And he said, but we're only a small part of the political equation and the global economy. And I said, I said exactly what you were saying, Henry. And Blair took that, and we ended up taking the leadership role all the way up to 2015 in Paris. And when I moved back into government to work with David Cameron in leading the climate change negotiations in Paris, David Cameron created a budget of £9.2 billion to help our negotiations. I was not allowed to tell the British public that. So there's another angle I'm going to tell you, which is a Prime Minister who feels that he's stuck his neck out by supporting us. And so what I was eventually told, don't even attempt to go on the public domain and explain this to them, or even boast about what Britain is doing, because the Sun and the Daily Mail will run a campaign and that'll be the end of your funding. Now, so the other angle is, when you've got a political party that is somewhat split, how do you keep it all together? You do things, but you keep quiet about it. It's actually very strange in a democracy, I believe.
That is
strange. It's almost undemocratic.
Yeah. It is.
And it's strange to me to hear that, leaders of the UK don't think that they have a big role in the global economy, because even if it is a small country relatively, with the many colonies that the UK has had in the past, they still have that influence, even if these countries aren't colonized anymore. And there was a lot of influence in the past, if it's not now. So definitely, I do think that the UK should be doing everything that it can, and I wish you guys luck, especially with the recent stuff that's been happening with your parliament. I don't know how else to explain it. But to end on a positive note, and I have heard some things already, but what is something that gives you both hope? For me personally, hearing from people who have worked inside the government and from experts such as yourself, it does help to see that there are people on the inside who are working and trying to do their best to move things along, and we just need more public pressure to help you guys do what you're doing inside as well. So that's something that brings me a lot of hope, because especially from all the way in the Philippines, when we're hit by typhoon after typhoon, and you just see these COP26 proclamations of global north leaders basically just not saying what needs to be said and not doing what needs to be done. It sometimes feels like there is no action happening on the inside, but it's really helpful to see that there are people on the inside working and pushing things, and there are things being changed. It's just, as Sir David said earlier, sometimes you can't talk about it. So yeah, what's something that gives you both hope?
You fire away.
So for me, if you think about like complex systems, the fact that solar power is falling, the price of solar power is falling so quickly, gives me hope, because it shows that complex systems can change fast, and they can change fast for the better as well as fast for the worst. So I think, that gives me, it's just one little thing, but it gives me a lot of hope.
I'm going to give it a rather more complicated answer. First of all, look at wind turbines. Who ever expected that the cheapest form of electricity in Britain would come from offshore wind turbines? And I'm a scientist, so I have to tell you why. Offshore, we're now building turbines that are the most efficient in the world. And the reason is because we can use shipping to take these very long turbine blades out to the site where they have to be installed. The blades are now 110 meters long. And so the kilowatt hours produced per wind turbine are massively, massively in excess of anything else. You can't build that on land because you can't get these long steel objects around on our roads. The second reason I feel optimistic is because young people are taking the bit between their teeth. I see young people around the world responding very well to the crisis, very well meaning they are concerned and they want to see a different world. Here in Cambridge, I'm talking to you from Cambridge University. If we advertise a position in the Centre for Climate Repair at Cambridge, we get more applicants per place than any other part of the university now. Right? The young people really want to do something that contributes to the future. And why would that be surprising? Right, so I think there are big things happening below the radar, as it were, and these will emerge. Let me give you, if I may, one more point, Mitzi. The company producing most turbines, by which I mean coal, oil, gas-fired turbines, is Siemens. And Siemens separated out Siemens Energy from the rest of the company because they couldn't handle this. And that part of the company, 90% of its profits come from producing these turbines, which they've produced for the last 120 years. They're the major world producer. They've got 8,000 engineers around the world. The new CEO, he's brought me in, and he has announced they're going to get rid of their dependence on turbines. And he's planning to do it in 10 years. Right, so this is telling their brilliant engineers, get thinking, guys. What are the alternatives to the use of fossil fuel-based energy systems? And it's very exciting. I get over to Germany to meet these people. There's a real sense of excitement, even from the older engineers, that at last their innovative capability is being channeled in the right direction.
I am also excited for a world where the fossil fuel industry isn't controlling everything anymore, and that we're not so dependent on it. So I would love to continue this conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours, but we don't have enough time. So I would like to really thank you both for a really insightful conversation, and thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Until next time.